Hello, everyone. It is 1 o'clock on the East Coast, and we are going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. My name is Jessica Enix, and I'm with the ACIL staff, and I'd like to welcome you to today's ACIL webinar. This is the last webinar in our sponsor series, and I'd like to take an opportunity to thank Agilent for their support of ACIL. ACIL appreciates their partnership, so thank you, Taryn and Agilent. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few points of protocol so that you'll get the most out of your webinar experience. Remember, you are listening to the webinar via conference service. If you are disconnected, repeat the steps that were given to you by the ON24 registration email. In order to reduce background noise, please be aware that all participant lines are muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and all questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Please note that today's program is being recorded and will be available to be viewed on ACIL's website. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Mr. Taryn Anmol. Taryn is currently the Director for Global Environmental and Food Markets at Agilent Technologies. Previously, he was an LC-MS application scientist at Agilent, focused on developing analytical methods for emerging contaminants in environmental and food matrices, including PFAS, PPCPS, algal toxins, veterinary drugs, and non-target identification using advanced mass spectrometry. He has over a decade of experience with focus on analytical solutions for environmental testing. Prior to joining Agilent, Taryn graduated with a PhD in Chemical and Environmental Engineering from the University of Arizona with a focus on water treatment strategies for water reuse and identification of emerging contaminants in the environment. Taryn has an MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a BS in Chemical Engineering. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Taryn Anmol.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be joining us from. I hope you're all staying healthy and safe. And again, thanks for taking the time to join in on this webinar today. So before I begin, I want to just provide a little bit of outline of the talk. The talk is meant to be a semi-aspirational look at what the future of PFAS testing lab would look like. So some of the things I'm going to mention may not be ready at this point, but are definitely where, at least in my opinion, the industry is moving. So without further ado, we'll get kicking into the talk. And again, briefly, I'd like to highlight what we're going to discuss today. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the market dynamics and the challenges for PFAS testing and how those can be addressed in this future PFAS testing lab. We'll also discuss what are the specific analyses of future full-service PFAS lab will be running. Most importantly, especially for a lot of our testing lab colleagues and friends on this call, we'll be discussing what are some of those driving factors to make revenue while doing PFAS testing, and what affects these costs, and what a lab in the future can do to increase their efficiency, maximize throughput, and provide the highest quality data with highest compliance and integrity. So with that, let's all step into the PFAS lab of the future. Now, I'm sure many of you on this call already know what PFAS are, so I'm not going to go into too many details on this. What I will highlight, though, is there can functionally be defined into two different classes when we talk about PFAS, and that's the per or the polyfluorinated alkyl substances. When we refer to the perfluorinated substances, we're really talking about then in the alkyl chain, all the hydrogens that are linked to the carbon are substituted with a fluorine. So you can see, for example, PFAS is a perfluorinated alkyl substance where all the hydrogens have fluorines in the alkyl chain, whereas the substance on the right is an example of a polyfluorinated alkyl substance because some, but definitely not all the hydrogens linked to the carbon in the alkyl chain are substituted. So functionally, you can see these can have quite different chemical properties as well, and certainly when you're analyzing them, they can behave quite differently, and that's important to note as well. Now, one of the things we know about PFAS is we continue to keep finding newer and newer ones in the environment. It seems like every time we think we have a hold on them, we find different classes in there. And there's great debate on this, but we suspect there's anywhere between 3,500 and maybe even up to 6,000 PFAS compounds that have been used in commerce, with a subset of those being present or expected to be present in the environment as well. So the paper I'm highlighting here is from 2017, quite a famous paper in the PFAS field by Wang et al. That lists at least 14 different subclasses of PFAS compounds. And you'll also notice on the right-hand side figure that while some of these compounds are quite well studied and mentioned in peer-reviewed literature, such as the carboxylic acids like PFOA, PFAS, and some of the other ones as well, there are also many different classes and many PFAS that are not really well studied and not very well referred to in literature. And that list only continues to grow as we find more and more PFAS. So this is a continuous challenge that a lab of the future has to address, where this increasing list and evolution of PFAS list is going to be something that has to be contended with. When we talk about PFAS, there really has been a boom, and there's no other word we can use for it. I like to call it the gold rush and also the race to the bottom. The gold rush in that just the amount of money being put into PFAS efforts is quite significant, especially in recent environmental history. For example, the estimated total remediation cost for PFAS contaminated sites globally is expected to be as much as $80 billion US. We also see funding from the federal government coming into this. We've seen over $400 million in funding be approved through congressional bills just in the US, specifically to deal with testing, treatment, and remediation of PFAS compounds. There have also been estimates of about 8 million PFAS samples that have been run in 2020 globally. So that's a huge amount and a lot of testing that's already ongoing. Another critical factor to point out, though, is from the experts, right? And you'll notice here that 71% of U.S. water operators in a survey listed that PFAS was among their top water quality priorities and concerns in their water catchments in the U.S. So almost 3/4 of water operators see PFAS as being an issue that has to be dealt with in their territories. When I refer to race at the bottom, what I'm really talking about is the different sorts of regulations and guidelines that we have, even just in the U.S. There are several states that have their own guidelines in what is perceived as slow movement from the federal government. A lot of states have taken it upon themselves to have PFAS guidance and regulations, certainly at least in drinking water, although there are also states now that have guidance and regulatory determinations in other matrices like food contact materials and things of that as well. But really what needs to be highlighted here, and even the chart that's shown in here is a little bit outdated now, is this dropping of detection levels and regulatory levels with time. For example, the US EPA has a health guideline of 70 nanograms per liter for a combined PFOA and PFAS. But you have states like California, Wisconsin, Michigan that typically have single-digit part per trillion levels for some of these PFAS, and in some states you also notice that there are different and newer PFAS that are also on regulatory and guidance levels. For example, North Carolina has Gen X, which is a newer PFAS that has been found in the environment as well. And then further, you also have some states like Massachusetts who are taking a precautionary principle kind of approach similar to what the Europeans do, where they are regulating or having guidelines for PFAS as a whole, as a group. So for example, in Massachusetts, they have a total PFAS level that has to be monitored as well. So these things make it really tricky for labs to, determine what levels they need to measure PFAS to, and getting different accreditations and things like that. So this is something that, will continue to move. I think we'll continue to see lower levels, and we'll also continue to see newer PFAS being added to regulatory and guidance levels as well in the future. Like I mentioned in the abstract, I'm not going to mention the word DOD, US EPA, or ASTM methods anymore, and that will not happen in this talk. However, many of you will be very interested in these analytical and current regulatory testing methods. And so to that, what I'll point you to is a dedicated PFAS website. Certainly, many folks have dedicated PFAS websites that you can find this information. I'm just pointing out the Agilent website, where if you go to agilent.com, directly under the Applications and Industries tab, there is a separate PFAS testing folder in there, and you'll get all the information on both the regulatory methods, but also new and emerging methods being used to analyze PFAS, along with a lot of application notes, methods, videos, webinars, training, and stuff that is tailored towards PFAS analysis. So if that is of interest and you want some of those details on the regulatory methods that currently exist, definitely check this out. What I want to highlight moving in to this talk, though, is some of the challenges that we currently face with PFAS testing and how that will be addressed by a lab in the future. So what I've really done is divided them into some critical aspects, where one of the biggest challenges that the PFAS testing labs face currently is this increased scope or the scope that is required to test for PFAS. You know, about 10 years back, we were really only interested in PFOA and PFAS, just two of them. Then we had 6 PFAS included in the UCMR list, and then we moved on from there to 14 on EPA 537, and then we had around 25 when we started looking at them in different matrices. But as I mentioned to you, there's potentially 4,000 possible PFAS, and we know that a significant number of those are expected to be in the environment. So we expect the scope of PFAS testing to continually increase, both in terms of number of PFAS we're testing, but also the levels will continue to probably drop lower and lower. But also what that means for us and what that means for a testing lab is, as I mentioned on the second slide, you start to get a number of new structures of PFAS that are being produced and present in the environment as well. You know, we are seeing certainly more volatile PFAS, for example. We're also seeing smaller chain PFAS, and as I mentioned, we're seeing different end groups and structures. So all this means it's not as simple as just adding a compound that is very similar to what you've already been doing, but in many cases, you know, this could require different testing methods and even different testing equipment. The second challenge that we deal with currently is the increased throughput. As I mentioned, there is a massive demand now for testing PFAS from a regulatory and compliance perspective to a remediation perspective through discharge permits and you know, product and consumer goods as well. So with that, you know, that continues to push the turnaround time demands as well and drop those. But also what it means for labs is that they require better methodologies to quickly gauge PFAS contamination. And I'll highlight how lab of the future, certainly a full service lab, will address these concerns. The other issue that I already highlighted is the extremely low detection levels and background issues. For those that are in the environmental industry, you know, I think a good way to think about this is, you know, the analysis of semi-volatile organic compounds, typically done by EPA 525 in drinking water or 8270 in wastewater. When we talk about low levels for semi-volatile compounds, we're still typically talking, in most cases, at part per billion, low to sub-part per billion levels, whereas in the PFAS, we are really looking to measure almost sub-part per trillion levels. So we're talking anywhere from 100 to 10,000 times lower sensitivity that we are expected to measure these PFAS compounds. And that needs to be understood in the context that these compounds are nearly ubiquitous in our work environments. They're used in a lot of lab products and commercial products in day-to-day life. And in many instances, they're even present in our blood and things like that. So to try to eliminate and keep that background as low as possible while you're measuring such low levels is always tricky. But again, there are ways that a lab of the future can address these issues. And then finally, again, like we talked about, the fast evolving regulations, you know, continuous changes there, and to be able to keep up with that, and new SOPs and new methods. So what I want to highlight, and I will later on as well, is it becomes really critical now with audits, accreditation, and data integrity, security, and compliance are going to become huge issues, of course, in the future as well. And that's something that a lab of the future has to keep in mind, specifically when dealing with PFAS, which has also relevance to defense-related work and national security-related things. So integrity and security becomes quite critical there. So what I want to say now is we're going to have a little bit of fun and move into a short time in the future in a galaxy that's really, really close, where a full PFAS testing lab exists and has mastered the ability to maximize efficiency and throughput. So if you will, you can close your eyes, that's optional, but we're going to take a jump a few years into the future now and look at how this lab of the future is addressing PFAS and testing for PFAS compounds. So some of the things this lab is having to deal with as against your current labs is some changes in and demand for testing. For example, the lab of the future, has significantly built upon the plane that is being built upon now. As many of you are aware, PFAS has certainly been an area where we've been building the plane as we fly it. And we hope that in the future, of course, that a lot of this is settled down and there is a plane with all the wings and landing gear set up and hopefully not as many birds flying around next to it. But in the future, regulatory and compliance testing is only going to go up significantly. That demand is going to continue, both in terms of, as I mentioned, number of PFAS that fall on the regulatory paradigm, but also in the number of different matrices. We will certainly expect testing for PFAS to have some sort of regulatory flow in food, air, and other commercial products with time as well. The other area where a full-service PFAS lab of the future will have to invest is what I'm going to call research testing, but shouldn't be thought of as a purely research play, but this is more of investigative/forensic testing. And this plays into the fact that there are many, many thousands of PFAS out there, and there will always be interest in trying to find out what are the newer PFAS and, how can those be measured in certain matrices as well. An area that certainly I expect a future PFAS testing lab to be looking into and be having to do a lot of testing is what I'm calling the surrogate and indicator testing. As I mentioned earlier on, we require tools to rapidly measure or have surrogates for PFAS so that we can determine very quickly if additional, more detailed testing is required or if remediation on sites is required. And so the surrogate and indicator testing by alternate quick and rapid methods is very critical and something that I will highlight as well. Turnaround times are only going to go down, so that is going to be a significant demand on a number of testing labs on how to determine to bring those turnaround times down. As I mentioned, we will be doing a lot of PFAS testing in the future in additional matrices, not only water, but we'll be definitely doing this testing in air, food, commercial products, and other things. Again, data compliance and security is a very critical aspect of this lab of the future doing PFAS testing. And unfortunately, probably the only thing that could go down is actually the analysis cost, because as demand goes up, that typically will lead to streamlining. This can actually be a positive for many labs though. The lab of the future can very much optimize their workflows and increase throughput, which actually can drive significantly the cost of analysis in the lab down. And so this in turn is actually a good thing for many of the testing labs. So this PFAS lab of the future is a full service PFAS lab, and for the remainder of the talk I will break it down into two things. We will talk about what are the testing offerings that a full service PFAS lab in the future will provide in terms of methodologies and testing capabilities. And then we'll actually go into a critical aspect for many of you, which is what are the attributes that this PFAS lab of the future follows so that it is maximizing its efficiency, has the highest throughput, and is providing the highest quality data compliance and integrity, so it is able to maximize its revenues on a PFAS testing. Spoiler alert, all the success from the PFAS lab of the future is only achieved through close collaboration with its partners. And this is, when I say partners, both its suppliers and also its end clients as well. So that is a very critical aspect, and I'll be highlighting how this collaboration and partnership is what makes this PFAS lab of the future a success. So now when we talk about the offerings in a full-service PFAS testing lab, Broadly, it can be divided into three different areas that this lab would be offering PFAS testing in. The first one is, as I mentioned, the surrogate and indicator analysis. So this is where the PFAS lab of the future is analyzing organic fluorine or reduction products of PFAS so that we can estimate the total load or concentration of PFAS at a site without having to specifically know the individual PFAS. This offers a lot of benefits because it can actually be a low capital cost test. It can be a rapid test. And because identification or speciation of the different PFAS is not required, it can actually make the data review and decisions actually a little bit more simpler at the beginning, at least, when taking preliminary decisions on whether, for example, remediation or discharge permits have been, potentially violated and things like that. So some of the tests that we would consider that the lab of the future is running are total fluorine analyses by combustion ion chromatography or CIC, organic fluorine products or reduction products by GC, typically with an electron capture detector. And then also what would kind of fall somewhere between the surrogate and targeted analysis is the analyses like the top assay or PIGI as well, where, again, it's not critical to know what all the end PFAS are, but we can get a good idea of how much PFAS load is present in a particular sample. The targeted PFAS analysis is still going to be the gold standard of testing. This is where we quantify specific PFAS either for regulatory compliance or requirements in permitting and things like that. The LC-MS is a very critical aspect, and that has been the traditional gold standard for PFAS testing, and it will continue to play a vital part. But what I'm going to highlight to you is this PFAS lab of the future is really making use of also GC-MS technology to do some sort of stacking for analysis of volatile PFAS and actually potentially increase their turnaround time on full service offerings of PFAS as well. And this again becomes critical to have this flexibility because you can be analyzing several different matrices in the future, as I mentioned, but the lab of the future will almost certainly be analyzing significantly more PFAS that are very different in chemical structures and properties as well. So again, that flexibility is very important in a PFAS lab of the future. And finally, to round off its offerings is the ability to analyze unknown or non-targeted PFAS. So this is here using typically high-resolution instruments for screening of PFAS for which we may not have analytical standards, and also potentially to identify new PFAS in the environment for clients that require them. And this can both be done with a LC high-resolution mass spec instrument, also a GC high-resolution mass spec instrument. And I'll highlight why both of them are critical. But the third aspect of this unknown PFAS analysis that holds great promise and is of much interest is actually in the field of what we would term as environmental forensics with chemometrics. So this is where potentially the data acquired on these high-resolution instruments can actually be used in forensically determining the cause and source of PFAS contamination at potential sites because of the unique ways in which PFAS can be manufactured and also discharged by different vendors and manufacturers. So this critical ability of having environmental forensics and very important software and statistical profiling tools is actually a huge area of growth and an area of revenue for this PFAS lab of the future. So going into the first one, as I talked about the surrogates and indicators, I want to highlight three different gas chromatography-based methods to target or track organic fluorine in a very quick manner. So all of these methods typically involve a very quick liquid-liquid extraction of a solid or liquid sample. Typically it takes less than 20 or 30 minutes. And then it gets injected on a gas chromatograph with an electron capture detector, which is a fairly inexpensive capital piece of equipment that is present in most contract testing labs in the environmental sector today itself. So one of the ways to do this has been monitoring organic fluorine peaks using a GC-ECD and using them as a surrogate for the amount of fluorine and hence the amount of PFAS that could be present in samples and taking decisions based on that for potentially remediation purposes. A second way of getting a little bit more detail on specifically PFAS is without identifying individual PFAS, taking them and actually reducing the bulk load of PFAS in the sample to end products that can be measured quickly and easily on a gas chromatograph. And for example, here I'm showing 3 breakdown products that are known to occur that are small small fluorinated molecules that we know can be linked back to the degradation of specific kinds of PFAS. And so this can be used then again as a summation total to determine the PFAS loading at a certain site, and determinations can be made whether additional testing is required for individual speciation of PFAS. And the final one is really a subset of the second one where this minimal chromatography can be used for rapid analysis. And these can actually also be done in the field with micro and mini GC instruments without really any sort of delay at all. Results can typically be got in the frame of 10 to 20 minutes. So this is a very critical tool for the PFAS lab of the future in providing rapid turnaround for information related to PFAS potentially at remediation sites and whether additional workup is required in terms of speciation of PFAS. A second tool when it comes to surrogate PFAS analysis is looking at total fluorine. In this instance, we are looking at total fluorine by combustion ion chromatography. I'd like to thank our colleagues from Metrome USA, specifically Jay Gandhi, for providing me these slides. And this is actually a technology that Metrome actually has commercially available now as well. So it's not so much looking at the future, but this is actually the present, where the system through a single liquid sample can actually measure both free fluoride and also measure the total organic fluoride, and the summation basically gives you the total fluorine, which is used as a surrogate for determining if there is potentially a high PFAS load in these samples as well. This is a very simple technique. Again, it's a fairly inexpensive lab tool. It does take a little bit of time because it does require sample preparation, typically through solid phase extraction, but those can be automated as well, as I'll highlight in the next few slides as well. But the big benefits of the combustion IC to measure the total fluorine is that we typically get robust combustion efficiency irrespective of matrix. So you can get pretty robust and reliable data out of these instruments for different kinds of samples. It offers significant flexibility, and it's actually quite sensitive and can measure sub-part per billion levels of total fluorine. And typically when you're thinking about that, if you sum all your PFAS, if it's of any significant concern, they should be around the ppb level as well. So the instrument offers enough sensitivity to be able to do this analysis both for solid and liquid samples as well. Now, the lab of the future, as I mentioned, is already running GC-based mass spec detection or quantification of these PFAS compounds. So the next couple of slides, I would like to credit our colleagues at Gustel US, specifically Kurt Saxton, for providing for some work they have performed. But one of the critical areas that the lab of the future sees as being both a revenue stream but also a requirement from a regulatory perspective is the measurement of PFAS in the air. This is something that is very critical, and many research studies have already shown that a large portion, anywhere between 20 and 40% of PFAS released from landfills and incineration sites can actually be volatile. So there is a significant driver to look at these compounds in the air. And so for that, really, it makes it very convenient when you use a thermal dissolver or a canister to couple it to a GC mass spec instrument. And again, this is something that is routinely available and done in environmental testing labs as well. So from a capital perspective, this is not a big investment at all. And as you can see here, separation of many of these PFAS, including very small and short chain PFAS, can happen on a GC instrument, but you also get the range for larger PFAS as well. And this example is showing a carboxylic acid range of PFAS from the C4 to the C14. And it's really suitable, especially for air analysis, when this can be coupled to a canister and thermal desorber by using a GC single quad instrument as well. However, the lab of the future is a little bit more advanced than that, and it wants to look at things that look a little better than this. For example, this is an example of 8,2-FTOH, a PFAS, where on a GC single quad, the SIM ion being monitored is 31, and as many of you know, that's a really low mass. So what that really means is a lot of times it's difficult to really say, is this good data quality because is it real or is it a matrix? So typically low masses equal high noise, which can be an issue with the risk of false positives. This lab of the future is very wary of that and wants to make sure they are not being driven to bad quality data. So which is why the second spoiler alert, the lab of the future is using GC tandem quadrupole mass spectrometry for better data. So that same sample, the lab is now able to analyze with the TD coupled to a GC triple quadrupole instrument, and making the use of multiple reaction monitoring, or MRM, which pretty much eliminates a lot of the noise. They now have a transition here that gives you a really clean peak for this compound and allows them to get lower detection levels, which in turn allows them to get better data quality data. And it also allows them to reduce sample prep because of the increased sensitivity that is available on the instrumentation. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the gold standard for testing of PFAS is on an LC-MS-MS or LC tandem quadrupole mass spectrometer, and that isn't going to change. Our typical hierarchy for this analysis is what we basically have today, and this will continue just with increased focus on throughput and reliability. Is typically we will be using a mix of methods that have sample enrichment with SPE. We will also have a mix of methods that have a dilute and shoot approach. And then finally, for the highest sensitivity, you do have direct injection methods where you're really stretching the mass spec instrumentation. This is nothing new, and again, a lot of the regulatory methods that I mentioned earlier on use these techniques. What I really want to highlight for you, where the lab of the future is creating a revenue stream, though, is the use of a high-resolution accurate mass instrument that provides enough sensitivity to do quantification on a routine and regulatory compliance basis. But the high-resolution mass spec is a real revenue generator for this PFAS lab of the future, because it allows them to do suspect screening and identify new and different PFAS that could be very important in remediation sites and for industrial clients in knowing potentially what sort of liability they might have. So an example of this is the lab of the future has a database of PFAS compounds outside of the standards that it has. So the benefit of this database is that they do not require to have individual standards and have to shoot them each time. The reason for that is because the high-resolution mass spec instruments measure mass accuracy very, very closely, potentially up to a fourth or fifth decimal place. And so it allows you high accuracy in identification. But what's also critical is that it is also tracking isotope patterns and fragment information as well. So when you put all of that together, along with the chromatography information through retention time and things like that, you can actually, with a very high certainty, without having an analytical standard, say if a compound is a certain structure or not. And one of the ways to make that easier is to actually store them in libraries so that you don't require analytical standards, and these can easily be screened or scanned through your samples very quickly as well. So an example of this is without having to use standards, but just based on accurate mass, fragment information, and isotope patterns, a lab of the future can use an LC-QTOF along with simultaneously quantifying their target PFAS to actually identify other PFAS compounds in that same sample as well. Now, another big benefit of using a high-resolution QTOF in this case, or a high-resolution accurate mass instrument, is a non-targeted annotation using in silico fragmentation features. So this is basically identifying new PFAS compounds based on predicted fragmentation and having information on molecular structure. If that sounded really complex, don't worry about it, because the lab of the future isn't worried about it as well. Because the good news is the software already does all of this for you. So you don't need to sit there and pull out your advanced environmental chemistry books. The software is smart enough to do a lot of this fragment prediction and molecular structure correlation for you as well. The data I'm showing you here is provided kindly by Jeremy Coleman at Yale University on some work he's done on Agilent QTOF in identifying new classes of PFAS compounds. So one of the things that was first done was this one compound was identified through a standard and was identified as having specific end groups. What can then be done in the software is that based on all the features that are identified in the mass spec, you can actually make plots such as the Kendrick mass defect, which is basically looking at differences in the nominal versus accurate mass of these compounds. And really, in essence, what it's able to do is you can actually predict whole series of compounds based on specific repeating units. And in the case of PFAS, we know very often that the repeating unit is a CF2, or it can also be a C, H, and F as well. So there are very few patterns that we know that PFAS molecules exist in, and making use of that along with the mass defect, we can actually identify series of compounds by just identifying one single compound in the sample as shown as well. So I won't go into the details of all of those. I could spend an entire talk talking about Kendrick mass defect and things of that. But again, these are software tools that make it very easy, in terms of easy charts. From identifying one or two PFAS, you can all of a sudden very quickly go to the software identifying entire new groups of PFAS with different functional end groups and things like that. And that's exactly what is shown here, where the graph on the left, each dot represents a different compound, and you notice that the same structures basically are indicating PFAS compounds with just different repeating units, but different classes as well. So this something that can be done really quickly as a forensics ID tool to identify a large number of new or unknown PFAS in your sample using the instrument and the clever software. Why is this important at all? Like, why should a lab of the future, why would they care about running a high-resolution instrument for PFAS analysis? Well, this is probably the best example I can give you. These are real samples that a lab has run on wastewater influent and effluent. And basically what they found was only 6% of the organic fluorine-containing compounds in the influent and effluent were captured in their targeted method of around 30 PFAS compounds. They also used a library, as I mentioned, of the 150 compounds to screen these samples, and another 10 to 16% of the fluorinated compounds could be tentatively identified. But that still left anywhere between 60 and 80% of organic fluorine-containing molecules in these water samples to be unknown. And we know that a high proportion of this is probably going to be anionic PFAS-based compounds as well. So what that really is telling us is there are a large number of potential PFAS in this sample that we are not collecting the data for, or we don't know. And this, for a lab of the future, can only spell dollar signs, because it is a revenue stream to identify new PFAS and provide new information that clients will be very hungry to know more about. Taking this a step further, this lab is very advanced, and they actually are what we call forensic hunters. They actually want to identify, can they actually predict where the PFAS contamination or who the PFAS contaminators are. This is some examples I'm showing you from work done at North Carolina State with Erin Baker and the ion mobility high-resolution instrument as well. The difference between an ion mobility high-res instrument and a straight liquid chromatography high-res instrumentation is basically the ion mobility allows you an extra dimension of separation. While on the LC high-resolution side, you get separation based on retention time by the chromatography. and then on the mass by the mass spec. In addition to those two on the ion mobility, you also get separation in a drift tube based on the shape of the molecule. So larger molecules typically will have a different time of travel in a vacuum versus smaller molecules, and this typically is determined by shape. And what this really allows us to do in an ion mobility is actually separate out isomers for different PFAS compounds. Now, why is that critical? Without diving back into our chemistry textbooks, we know that a lot of PFAS manufacturers use different fluorination techniques to create these PFAS. And that, in many cases, creates different kinds of isomers and different ratios of branch to linear isomers as well. So when you can actually separate these out on an ion mobility, it actually becomes a lot easier to predict who the culprit or who or where the contamination was coming from, because you have very specific isomeric signatures between the different PFAS vendors that are present in different PFAS contamination sites as well. So this is again a very critical tool, and here is an example of showing a separation of seven different PFAS isomers on the ion mobility. These are very powerful tools as well, because now you can kind of try to forensically determine where the contamination sources are actually coming from and not just what the contamination source is. So this, again, for the lab of the future, they are looking at this as a huge revenue stream and potential large legal liability issues being solved here as well. The last method, because this is a full service PFAS lab, is they're also smart enough to run a GC high resolution instrument as well to identify volatile PFAS compounds. And so you might ask, why is this different from using a GC triple quadrupole instrument? Well, because again, a high resolution instrument measures mass very accurately. For example, here, if you measured the FTOH compound on a nominal mass instrument, like a nominal mass top or a GC single quad, you would notice that there was a change in mass of 38. And that could mean either the loss of F2 for 2 fluorines, or it could actually mean a loss of an H2O and an HF as well. So with an accurate mass instrument, we can actually say based on the mass error that it was actually a loss of an HF and an H2O. And what that allows us to do, similarly to before, as I showed you on the LCQ top, is actually go and identify different kinds of PFAS molecules based on those nominal mass losses as well. And then that's exactly what has been done here for different classes of more volatile PFAS compounds as well. So what I want to do is shift for the last 10 minutes to talking about how this lab maximizes its productivity and efficiency. And what I'm calling the golden metric here is return on investment. Ultimately, as a testing lab, if you do not get a high return on investment, there is no requirement to do the testing from your perspective, because it's not a money maker. All right. So what I'm going to highlight here is some of the attributes that the PFAS lab of the future takes into account when it's thinking about the PFAS testing. And there are 7 attributes I'm going to highlight. Some of them are related to revenue, and some of them are related to expenses and indirect costs as well. The first thing to consider is really billable throughput and turnaround time. This is probably one of the most critical things for a testing lab to consider, because the revenue really is the number of samples that can be run and the price being charged for the samples, and that is really driven by the lab's turnaround time or TAT. Now, what is going to be critical here in the lab of the future, as I mentioned, is you're going to be doing a number of different kinds of testing on a number of different instruments that have to be put together to submit to as a final report to your customer. And so instrument speed becomes critical, but it also becomes really critical in identifying what your rate limiting steps for these analyses are. And in many cases, as you are aware, for PFAS analysis, the rate limiting step, as with most environmental analysis, is typically on the sample preparation side. So hence, automation on there is the one that can help significantly streamline throughput and also improve productivity in this lab. Here's some stuff I'm showing from our colleagues at LC Tech who were kind enough to provide some of these slides on automated offline sample preparation. This is a dedicated sample prep instrument for PFAS compounds. It is minimized for fluorinated or fluoroplastic compounds, and so has a constantly low PFAS background. It's also robust enough to allow automation, and it has a robotic arm that can simultaneously do the loading and conditioning of cartridges and things like that make it really critical in a lab. But the big benefit here is it allows batching in lab operations. And what I mean by that is you can be doing sample preparation while the instrument is actually running samples from the previous day. And so that way, if there are delays on one side, it doesn't stop the entire operation. So what are the features of the automated sample prep device that the lab of the future has? Well, the system is equipped with polypropylene bottles and tubing to make sure there's no background coming from PFAS, at least from the instrument. It also has the ability to automatically use multiple cartridges and elution into different containers. This makes it critical when you're looking at flexibility of different matrices, but also different kinds of PFAS having to be analyzed. The ability to load samples and rinse out the bottles automatically, so there is no requirement of manual input or labor in here. And then, of course, finally, what's critical is having intuitive and simple software with preloaded or drag and drop editing that makes it really easy to make changes on the fly if required, while at the same time having robust and routine compliance methods to make sure they can run without intervention. The other option to use for sample preparation, though, is on the automated SPE side. And here, what some of the benefits are is this is coupled directly to the instrument. And because of that, you can load a lot larger mass of the PFAS compound onto the instrument, which requires and which means that you actually need very low sample volumes to do that analysis. So typically from using hundreds of ml, the lab of the future can move to single-digit ml to analyze without any drop in sensitivity. And the real benefits of this online SPE are it reduces the sample volume with no loss in sensitivity. It significantly reduces solvent usage in this lab, and it also reduces internal standard use because you have to spike a lot lower volume of sample, while at the same time increasing reproducibility and reducing potential contamination points because there's really no manual sample preparation involved in this at all. So this is a big, again, area of looking into for productivity and streamlining. And ultimately what it does is it's faster time to results because the online SPE can provide you answers in about 20 to 30 minutes because the large volume sample preparation is not required. But it's not all about sample preparation. The smallest thing can make the biggest differences in the lab. And one of the examples is on the sample handling and storage. So PFAS-specific vials that are available to this lab of the future actually have a unique bilayer of polypropylene and silicone that allows resealing. Why is this critical? Because PTFE can potentially, the PTFE that's present in the liners of the caps can actually have some PFAS potentially as contamination. And so to avoid that, most labs would use just a polypropylene cap, and once that is punctured, there's no way to reseal it, which means you could actually have loss of solvent and loss of sample with time, and that typically means labs can actually have to use 2 or more caps per sample for longer term storage. So just using this unique resealing cap means you actually save on, potentially halving or even more than that, the number of vials and caps that are used in the lab for sample prep and analysis as well. Fortunately, this is a vial and cap that is actually available at this point as well, so you don't have to be a lab of the future. You can be the lab of the present and still do these analysis this way as well. Another big area is eliminating PFAS contamination, and this is basically standardized in the future. The lab of the future has this all characterized through their partnerships with instrument vendors. And these are standard tools and kits that are available and actually configured on the instrument as well. Here are some of the things that need to be changed, and all these are actually identified and taken care of by the vendor itself. So the lab of the future doesn't have to concern themselves with having to do any of these changes. Another aspect that the lab of the future has to consider is multidimensional agility. And what I mean by that is basically the ability to handle multiple different kinds of samples and different matrices. And also that batching that I talked about, where if you only had an LC-MS instrument, you would be limiting yourself both in terms of the amount of testing you can provide, but also that it would have to be run in a batch process of, a fixed amount of samples per day, whereas Lab B that has a GC-MS, an LC-MS, and a high-resolution instrument actually has a lot more flexibility in improving the attach, because now you have not only multiple instruments for redundancy, but you also have multiple different kinds of analyses that can be performed at different times that adds value to your customer as well. Another benefit of having this agility is by creating or making use of MRM databases that are already created by the analytical vendors. So here is an example of an MRM database that has 100 PFAS compounds already preloaded in it. And all you have to do now is, if you want to perform this analysis, is with a single drag and drop, you can actually add new PFAS compounds into your method without having to spend time on expensive standards or spend time on unnecessarily optimizing new compound parameters in there. All this is already available to the lab of the future, and this significantly saves them time from having to increase scope and identify and analyze new PFAS compounds. Another area is the quality control management. This is very critical, as I mentioned, in the future in terms of compliance. And the question really is, does your lab really want to be known as providing accurate and the highest quality results? If that's the case, then it's absolutely critical to have data compliance and data integrity management and softwares. And that is what I will highlight in the next couple slides. I'm highlighting here Agilent's compliance and data integrity tools. Of course, I'm sure this is available from multiple different vendors. But in our case, some of the critical aspects for Lab of the Future are to make sure there is a mandatory login to know who is using the instruments. Also, role-based security so that no one has complete access. Operations being enabled and disabled based on what your privileges and roles are. Also, the ability to store data and track data and make them tamper-proof are very critical. Method versioning and audit trails are other things that are critical as well. And then probably one of the most critical aspects is the secure file storage at an off-site online server so that those can be accessed at any time. Now, one of the other critical features of compliance is that this needs to be across instrumentation. As I mentioned to you, a full-service PFAS lab in the future is going to be using many different instruments from many different vendors as well. And so the ability for your compliance tools to spread across those different instruments from different vendors is critical. Again, in this case, I'm highlighting a feature on the Agilent Open Lab ECM, or electronic compliance. Is basically the ability to not only handle different Agilent instrumentation, but it can also, for example, handle the IC from Metrome that I highlighted before as well in a compliant manner. Again, all of these data can, as I mentioned, be stored. Long-term archival can be done off-site, and they can also be specific indexing and regulatory compliance and audit trails fixed to specific kinds of audits that have to be dealt with as well. So having this flexibility for the lab of the future provided and working in conjunction with a vendor that provides this saves them a significant amount of time and workload as well, while having audit trail managers available both internally and externally that can categorize these things as well. Now, coming to a last couple of things that are really critical that are often not thought about is fast but realistic implementation times, right? This is not something that is often thought about, but the ability or the speed to get a method up and going can be significant, can have a significant impact on revenue as well. So the factors to consider here beyond, just the capital cost of an instrument are actually the implementation of the time frame, or at what point can you actually get production and billable samples running with a validated method, right? And so things to consider with this for the lab of the future are the availability of strong service and support from their partners. Also, ability to provide training for their training staff. And one of the big benefits of this is if you have multiple instruments in the lab that operate on the same server and the same software, it means cross-training is automatic with your different staff, and so that actually saves significant amount of time when these different kinds of analyses are being performed as well. So that's a critical factor for the lab of the future. Now, downtime is always present. No matter what instrumentation, no matter what lab you are, no matter how great of a scientist you are, there will always be downtime irrespective of instrumentation or testing that is performed. Now, routine maintenance is something that can be dealt with in a lab, and that typically is not a significant issue because it is routine and planned. The biggest time sinks, though, are the unplanned downtime that requires servicing, and then also software issues. This can be both, of course, software crashes, but also having to learn different software, update different software can be huge time sinks, and also can significantly affect morale in the lab as well. That all of this will affect your turnaround time. The other thing that is critical to consider that many people forget is many people actually go with instrumentation that does just enough. And especially in the PFAS world, you want to be thinking about getting instrumentation and technology that does future-proof you in the future, both in terms of sensitivity, reliability, and software as well. A couple of quick examples to round up are, on the benefits of using faster maintenance is, the use, for example, of a tool that allows you to not break vacuum and clean the instrumentation. So, for example, here on an LCMS, this can shift in maintenance time from 6 hours to just 30 minutes from a simple tool like this. Also, on the GC, as I mentioned, the lab of the future would be using GC testing. The use of guard chips instead of trimming a column can be significantly benefited. As the lab of the future would like to say, column trimming is so 2019. When you can use a guard chip, it basically takes 5 seconds to swap it in and out. And what that also allows you to do is, because there is no column trimming, it doesn't mean that the lab has to now shoot a couple of injections to readjust the retention time. So you're talking potentially hours in time savings and significantly easier operation for maintenance as well. And then finally, the early maintenance feedback tool is a huge savings for the lab of the future, because what this allows them to do is actually significantly move and operate their consumables and maintenance using what we would define as smart alerts. So this means that the lab is actually having an electronic way of monitoring when consumables need to be changed out on the instrumentation and how that can be done versus having to kind of eyeball it through experienced operators. So this is a software that is installed on the instrument that actually automatically tracks both the instrument set points to know when potential maintenance may be required, but also sends automatic alerts on when consumables required to be changed on the instrument as well, and also has the ability to perform recommended maintenance too. So with that, I want to quickly just wrap up with the last thing, and I'll mention this and say, one of the things to consider is not just the capital cost, but also the entire affordability of the analysis. And this will vary based on, your lab, and something that you highly want to consider before you get into the PFAS analysis. But there are significant avenues for PFAS growth and testing that should certainly be looked at by environmental testing labs and beyond. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I've just added here additional resources if you're interested, and also feel free to contact me if you should have any questions that you'd like to discuss. So with that, thanks a lot, and Jessica, I'll hand it back to you if we have a couple minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Taryn, for your presentation. And we do have a couple of questions to get to. The first one is, do you see the analysis by GC or IC for total fluorine used in conjunction with PFAS quantitation methods?
Yes, absolutely. So the goal of the surrogate or indicator analysis with the GC, ECD, and the IC is meant to provide a very quick template for us to know how much of potential PFAS may be present in that sample, and then make quick decisions whether additional speciation or individual analysis of PFAS is required using an LCMS or GCMS instrument. But absolutely, I see them being used in conjunction almost as different tiered instruments.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is, what is current and near future library situation for HRMS non-targeted analysis in both LC and GC techniques?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I can say is there's a lot of work going on in this area by both analytical vendors and by a lot of consensus groups as well. I think the EPA, for example, is looking at a large update of PFAS in their CompTox database. There's also the Norman network that has a number of open source availabilities. What I'll just highlight with there is, with a lot of these open source, it provides you great information, but you have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt because you're not really sure of the data validity. So that's where I think manufacturers come in, where they can provide curated databases. So there's a nice sweet spot there between providing curated databases of a smaller set of PFAS versus using larger sets that are, open source and potentially, maybe not as highly curated as others.
Great. Okay, how do you remove interferences of, for example, chlorine when analyzing with GC ECD?
That's a really good question, and I think that's a discussion I'd love to leave for my technical folks to talk about. But yeah, certainly I think that's a known issue of potentially having other halogens that can be potentially interfering or overlapping with the fluorine with an ECD as well.
Okay, thank you. Can any of the automated prep solutions filter or GCB clean up the sample?
I'm not sure on that. I'll have to get back to the person asking the question on that. That's probably a question for my sample prep folks, and also maybe to reach out to some of the LC tech teams that are doing some of that work.
Okay. And then we have one last question, and it's what standards can be implemented to compare data between labs when doing non-targeted testing? Metadata?
Yeah, that is a great question, and actually a lot of work on that is happening by NIST and folks at the FDA and stuff to try to look at standard cocktails or mixtures of compounds that could potentially be taught as a calibration standard. What I'll say is, there really isn't. There's a thought that really that doesn't require standards at all. There are enough other safety factors in there that without standards you can determine how good the data quality on a high resolution instrument is by just monitoring, mass accuracy drift. Also, vendors provide tuning criteria that are very specific for, looking at isotopic patterns and things like that. So I think there are definitely tools in there. I wouldn't go as far as saying any of those are standardized, but I think we're certainly moving in that direction.
Okay, excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that's all we have time for today. Again, thank you, Taryn, for your presentation, and thank you, Agilent, for your support of ACIL. And thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to everyone joining us on our next ACIL webinar. Everyone have a great day.